I guess it's the after school tutorial session of AP US history. We're looking at, let's see if I can make this work. Yes, I can. Excellent. We're looking at chapter 6. This technology, of course, will get better as I get more dexterous, as I figure out how to use it better and what that does. This has got 3 parts to it, as you remember me talking about today in class. One, it's going to be talking about the Revolutionary War, the Revolutionary period. That period is going to be kind of, believe it or not, it's not the really big focus of this chapter. Um, but we kind of date it from 1776, although the war didn't start for another year or two later. And it goes until about 1782, 83, when the Peace of Paris ends that up. That's the first thing. So talking about the Revolutionary War, not a whole lot of things you need to know about the time period with relation to battles or whatnot. Like because of that, there's only a couple that we pay attention to. But the key thing that I like to talk about is the significance of how this war was similar to, get rid of that, how this was similar to Great Britain fighting almost like a version of our Vietnam War. They are the most powerful country in the world. They have the best technology in the world. They have the best army, the biggest navy. All of the biggest goes to them. It'll almost be the same as the United States. But for the United States, one of the things that we have in our favor, of course, is the distance. The distance is what's going to kill the British. The supply lines, the communication lines, the distance between home. These are all factors that are going to be significant in making it for a difficult time period for the British. That's the first one. The other thing that's unique is that the locals, the rebels, if you will, the Americans who choose to fight, the rebels are going to fight a style of warfare that's going to look like, but is not, guerrilla warfare. We're going to see guerrilla warfare later in the 20th century employed during the Cold War. But guerrilla warfare takes the principle that if you have an army that is not as technologically advanced, not as strong, not as well equipped, the best you can do is to survive. And one of the words that kind of describes that survival concept is a battle for attrition. Attrition is, I'm not going to win, but I'm going to force you to leave. And that is eventually what the British decide to do, making the deals that push them out of the war and make them head back home with the redcoats and their navy in tow. The other thing about the Revolutionary War is it is looked upon as being a interesting war to unify the classes. I keep doing this silly thing here. Let's see if I can figure out how to not to do that. It unifies the American classes. Although it is an elites war, the elites are going to benefit from this. The elites are going to have the advantages after the war is over. There is a concept that if we participate, if we win, that there is a potential that you could move from one class to the other. That's totally different than in the British concept where you have to be born into it. And if you can get into the middle class, they look down upon you because you didn't make it. You didn't have the concepts in place to make this all work. Another thing that shows up strongly is this interesting one-third principle. We had this, we have a stereotype that the Americans are born rebels, and it goes back to those early days when I was talking about salutary neglect. I was also talking about the Enlightenment, and I was talking about the Great Awakening. These are all factors that drive this revolutionary spirit into the American consciousness. However, for most Americans, they are not seeing this war as a good option. So 1/3 are going to remain loyal. They're going to be described as the Tories. They will remain loyal throughout the war. 1/3 want to revolt. These are the rebels. And then 1/3 is simply undecided. And being undecided, that's not a very good percentage to go into any kind of event with. The rebels are going to have to use every form of persuasion, coercion, and in some cases deception to keep the public from falling apart. But the nice thing that the rebels have is they have a bit of a home field advantage. They're fighting for home turf. And home field advantage is pretty huge in a war because most of the time you can play defense. You can pick the location to defend. You can pick the geographic area to defend. That's kind of an important concept. So the British are going to have to be on offense. The Americans can play defense, and for the most part, they can pick and choose their battles. They're being led by several veterans of the French Indian War. The most significant, of course, that emerges is the general from the French Indian War. That's going to become our first president of the United States, first president of our Constitution. His name is George Washington, of course. His big gift to us is his concept of organization that's going to allow his forces, although weakly equipped and everything else besides that, his organization is going to be crucial in helping to win the war and helping to make that war take place and shape. That is a really big difference in terms of what goes on. So for the most part, the Americans lose almost every battle. They fight in the city of New York. They fight at Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill, depending on which hill you're talking about in Boston. And each one that they fight, each battle they fight, the British are going to drive them off the battlefield. But they survive each battle, which is kind of the important concept. There's survival during those years where a lot of members of this army of Washington's are a citizen army. So that means that he was constantly fighting two battles at the same time. He was fighting the British, but also these were mostly farmers who had to go home to survive by planting their crop and harvesting their crop. These farmers are going to make his life miserable because he can't keep a field army on the battle ground for much more than maybe 3 months at a time. And he's shuffling forces back and forth and back and forth. And it's giving the British, all of the advantages in terms of like holding the Americans at bay. The good news is that the longer that the Americans last, the more the British get upset. Because remember, back at home, the British didn't really want to have the Americans break away. A lot of British people in Parliament, parliamentarians and other critics were saying this is something that was stupid, we shouldn't be doing this anyway. And the problem is that King George is crazy and the Parliament is unwavering in terms of their their focus of taxation, so it's pushing them in that direction. All right, so what else can I tell you about? One of the key battles of this time period is Saratoga. Saratoga is in upstate New York. It's a battle where a small army of the British, a small contingent of the British army is going to be trapped by the Americans. This victory for the Americans is one of the only victories on the battleground which gives not only a confidence boost, but the key is that we had been lobbying the French for months to get into the war on our side. The big thing that the French could add is the French could add a competitive navy, which could get the British off our backs and open up our trade, which could, of course, make us money to buy more weapons. The other thing that they wanted was they wanted to pull the war back to Europe. They wanted this war to leave the colonies, go back to Europe. The French maybe are angling for this for a couple of reasons. This is pre-French Revolution, of course. So one of the things that Louis XVI is probably thinking is he needs to make money back too. And one of the things that he has available to him that he lost during the French Indian War are all of his colonies. So perhaps he's entering this war with the concept that I might go back into the Mississippi River Valley and make some more money on fur. But the other thing that he's probably after, of course, is to just beat the British from dominance, because the British beat him in the French Indian War, and he wants to get himself back into the game, if that makes sense. So with that being said, oh darn, don't want to do that, go back. With that being said, let's see, there we go. With that being said, Saratoga is what brings the French in. And because the French enter the war, the French enter on our side, it pulls tremendous pressure off of our objectives on the battlefield. So that's huge. Once the French enter, we begin to figure out that the one thing that the Americans need, the colonists need the most of, is they need to push the British out. Every time you beat them, it's like Vietnam. Every time they get beat on the battlefield, what I mean by that is every time we survive to fight another day, the British government, the British people are saying they're failing. Just like the Americans said, we're failing in Vietnam. Even though we were winning every battle in Vietnam, the problem was it felt like we were losing. So one of the things that the Americans and the French wanted to do is trap a British army, and that was actually an event that took place at Yorktown, where an entire contingent of Cornwallis's army, who was a general of the British, who had been fighting against Washington for many years. Cornwallis is trapped. He's forced to surrender. He surrenders honorably on the battlefield. We accept the surrender. The British go home, and we begin to negotiate a deal or a peace. And this peace that we're going to talk about is going to be negotiated in Paris on our turf. And eventually it will come to be known as the Peace of Paris, and it comes out in 1782-83. They negotiate that deal. And it provides our sanctity of our territory. It provides all of our people with a different organization structure. It also gives the French several of the British colonies, and it forces the British into making a deal with us, which I don't think they wanted to make. I really don't, because I think most of the British believe that the Americans were part of their empire. They should stay. They speak the same dang language anyway, and they should possibly just hold on to them as long as possible. But that didn't work out. So that is mostly what I think is the significance of the Revolutionary War, and that's where that heads. Now, on the other front, once we win, we have to create a new government, which is not easy to do. So our government that we create is something that will go down in history as the first American government, the first United States government. Articles of Confederation are what it's going to be known as. It will be a loosely aligned band of 13 states. Each state is responding to the Revolutionary War based on what happened. So, for instance, the problem with having a king and a parliament, which dominated most of our decision-making and most of our thinking at this time in history. Well, one, the problem is that it was looked upon that the king and parliament were absolute in terms of their power. There were no checks, no balances on the power of the king. There is no representation. So our concept was, if we don't have a say, we're being ripped off. And it was arbitrary. It was only designed to help one side, not the other. We weren't able to get into the negotiations. We weren't able to get out. So as a result, here's what happens. We go from a parliament to the opposite side of the spectrum, like I mentioned today. We head all the way over. No, oops, I was going to make an arrow, not that. Let's see if I can make an arrow. Nice. Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation are the polar opposite of what we had before the Revolution. The Articles of Confederation are our guarantee that we will not go down the road of dictatorship and kings and parliaments that don't listen to us. Excuse me. So what do we have? We have no executive authority. Why? No king, right? Fear the king, no executive. The second thing is that we wanted to have no taxation, because that's the problem we had in the first place. But no taxation means no government. The other thing we had, which was a problem, was we had this concept of agreement, I guess is the best way to put it, that was very unrealistic. Most agreements had to be 2/3 votes or unanimous, which I think is pretty stupid, because you can't do anything on a unanimous vote, because there's going to be somebody who's going to be upset, somebody who's going to feel like they're being ripped off. Then the last thing was there was no national judiciary which could mediate disputes. So what you got is you had 13 states doing their own thing. Rhode Island's doing its thing. Virginia's doing its thing. Each state has a different economy, objective. Each of them has a different relationship with each other. And eventually we came to pass that there was several different disagreements that took place that could not be mediated. And it started to break down. And this is where Daniel Shea comes in. Because Daniel Shea is our trigger mechanism. He's the trigger that's going to force a change. That's not Z's, those are G's, just so you're aware. Get out of the way. So Daniel Shea, what is his big trigger mechanism? Well, his trigger mechanism is designed to put fear into the landed elites. And the elites look at him as a potential threat, because by the time he shows up, now we have a French Revolution taking place, and it's starting to look like that's the lay of the land. If you don't take care of the poor, they're going to rise up, take over, and chop off your head. So Daniel Shea forces the elites to get together. Don't do that. What are you doing? And as the elites got together, they started to drift back in this direction, saying we need to fix something. First, they met at Annapolis. That's the first meeting. They realize they can't fix the problem. Then they go a little further down the road and they meet at Philadelphia. And as they meet at Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, they're going to start to negotiate deals that are going to make us have a new form of government. These deals are crucial because everything for the next, let's face it, everything from then till now is dependent upon these deals that are struck and how they're interpreted. And this final product is known as the Constitution. And the Constitution, as you know, is the document by which all of our rules are shaped and take place. Ooh, where'd I go? Come back, Hoy, come back. Here's the key about the Constitution that you don't often really know about. If it's a group of elites, these founding fathers of ours, all of them male, all of them in their 30s and 40s, some of them in their 50s, which is old for that time period. All of them, except for one. What the heck just happened? Undo that. Or I'll just leave it. That looks kind of cool. Looks like flights. These elites who have a problem also realize that the poor and the middle class are crucial in this new concept of representative democracy, that you need to have their backing. If you don't have their backing, it's all going to fall apart. And that was the radical concept that was coming up, which is we need to use average people, perhaps, to validate this. Now, the average people would not participate, not for a long time, but the average people are what we're afraid of, like Daniel Shea, because we don't want him to, lose power. The key elite guy, oh, got it, came back. The key elite guy who led the discussions was a guy by the name of James Madison. He's known as your father of your Constitution, but he was really powerful in a philosophical and a political way in creating deals, compromises, if you will. Compromises which took two vastly different positions. He was able to get creative enough and hope, I don't know how, but he was able to get it so certain deals were struck. And these deals are crucial to how power is broken down today. The biggest discussion of all is about who makes all of the rules. Now, we wanted that to be in the hands of a group. We don't want one person, of course, because that looks like that monarchy again. So we wanted to copy the British system. We wanted to copy Parliament. But Parliament, remember, was flawed. Parliament had this group of people that all had self-interest, and they all were following their rules. They were all following everything else that they were coming up with. So one of the key rules was the lawmaking branch that makes all of the deals. But most importantly, what do you do with all of the tax dollars that you collect? How do you spend them? Who gets to decide where they go? Who gets to decide what's going on with tax dollars? So the argument was advanced by different delegates that we should have different systems. Little New Jersey is a small state. Its territory was locked in. It had a small population for the most part. It was worried that big states, big populations, big territories would overwhelm it. So they wanted to stick with the Articles concept of having one or two delegates to the body of power that would be known as our Congress. We don't want to call it the Parliament because we don't want to copy the British too closely because it looks like we're hypocrites. Also, we want to be our own people, so that's another way of doing it. But the New Jersey plan was one or two delegates, everybody's equal. That's the key thing. Everybody's equal, and nobody's in charge of everybody else. So that was advanced. People said, yay, especially people like Rhode Island, Connecticut, small states. And then here comes big old Virginia. Virginia, the oldest colony. Virginia, the biggest colony. Virginia, the largest population. The Virginia plan wanted it based on something called proportional representation. Proportional equals based on how many people you have. More people, more seats. Virginia would have the most of them all. So Virginia loves this plan. Virginia is going to dominate. In fact, Virginia is going to destroy New Jersey when it comes to votes. And New Jersey, if it doesn't get a bunch of friends to back it up, it's going to be in a huge amount of trouble. So Madison got together with the different people. This was the key sticking point. Who's going to make the rules? How are we going to decide on taxes? And Madison came up with a really interesting proposal that he got the state of Connecticut, which was a small state with a large population, to kind of back. And it became known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. Oops, Connecticut Compromise. Also known as the Great, just so you know that that's the same thing. And the Connecticut Compromise created what was called a bicameral system. Bicameral means two houses. And it was kind of ingenious. It's like going to the salad bar and picking out what you want. The first concept was we would have a Senate. The Senate would have 2 delegates from every state. All state delegates have an equal vote because there's 2 of them. Therefore, we have this concept of equality that New Jersey liked. But on the other hand, we'd have a House of Representatives, House of Reps. And that would be based on proportionality. So the proportionals would put Virginia in the top seat. But here's the sticking point. To make a law, you have to pass both houses. If you can't pass both houses, no bill goes to advance forward. So that was the safety valve, a check and a balance, if you will. And this first check and the balance got people to pay attention to what was going on. That was kind of crucial. We had a regional debate, which is one of the more insidious debates. And the regional debate was between the North, that was growing in population with immigration, and especially the South. The South, that was low population, low density, but also had a lot of African slaves that were imported and were working on the plantations that were making most of the cash crops. North and South, you got to win. Here's the key thing. For this Constitution to work, you need 2/3 of all of the states to say yes. That's 9 of the 13. You have to get some people from the South to say yes. You cannot push this through just on the northern end of things. So one of the things that shows up was that they had to make a deal with the South. So what was the deal going to be? Well, what the South's worry was, Virginia had a big population, but South Carolina didn't. Georgia didn't. They were worried that if they didn't have this representation boost in Congress, that they would have a problem. So here comes one of the most insidious deals ever crafted by humanity. It's called the 3/5 Clause. The 3/5 Clause is in your original Constitution. It has been struck out by your 15th Amendment. But the significance of the 3/5 Clause is that it shows you how deeply slavery and race relations were entwined within our early government. Here's the concept. We're going to count slaves as a fraction. For every slave, sorry about that. For every slave, we're going to count them as 3/5 of a person. Put 2 slaves together, you have a person and a fraction. Every slave we count is going to add to the proportionality of our state. Therefore, a state like South Carolina, who might have something like, let's just make it an even number. They have 1 million white citizens, but they have 2 million slaves, which was not uncommon in the South because a lot more people in the South were working on the slaves as slaves than owners. Well, if you did 3/5, you'd have more than 1 point some odd million slaves counted towards the seats. So what would it do? It would give South Carolina more seats, which means they would have more influence on the laws, which means they would probably favor slavery, they would probably favor Southern issues, and of course that's a problem if you're dealing with that concept. That deal, unfortunately, was one of the more nastier ones that comes up in our discussion. All right. On the other hand, there was a desire to put an executive in power. And the deal that made the executive work was that they actually got George Washington to agree to be the president of the Constitutional Convention, which meant he sat there and presided and gave his wisdom when needed, but he was the force that was like the steady hand of wisdom. But George Washington also agreed to become the first president. And he wanted to be called Mr. President because he did not want to be called Your Excellency, Your Lordship, all of the different titles that were there. But he also sets a lot of the ways and the traditions of presidencies that will follow all the way to the present day. One of the first things that he did was, it wasn't a law, but he stuck with 2 terms because he said 2 terms is enough, and then give somebody else a try. What does it look like? We don't have a king. Beautiful, perfect. Another thing is, keep your mouth shut for the most part, because let Congress do all of the work and you just step in when needed. And that was another thing that he kind of, we noticed about presidents is that most presidents don't really actively make policy. They're just enforcing it, and they make statements based on that enforcement. So that was another thing. He wasn't pushing to have things, move very quickly because there wasn't a lot to move at that time. There wasn't a lot to do. And of course, he created a lot of the customs of how we treat a president and also how we relate to presidents today that gave them a more human rather than a godlike status that was mostly what Europeans were doing with their leaders at the time period. What was the most important? I just had it on the tip of my tongue. The most important concept of Washington, though, if I can just refresh my memory and just hit reboot for a second here and think about it. One of the most important things about Washington, that's what it was. He was not afraid to use force. Okay? Here's the key thing. When needed, use force. Because a president is not a pushover. A president has to be the force of the state. And what we'll find happen in his early term when we start looking at, I think, the next chapter, is that there will be something called the Whiskey Rebellion. Well, he'll use actual American troops to enforce taxation on whiskey in the western states. And we're not afraid to use it. And the reason, of course, is that the executive wanted to have that power. And then the last thing is we created a Supreme Court and federal courts. And the Supreme Court and the federal courts were a whole series of courts. They don't decide criminal cases. They decide constitutional questions. How does it relate to the Constitution? And those are where we start to debate how interactions between the public and the government go down. If you put this together, if you put the Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court together, these three are the first three articles of your Constitution. They're the main articles of your Constitution. Those are where most of the writing is. But it also creates this really, really cool concept that Montesquieu talked about a long time ago called separation. Separation of powers. That you have a division of powers between the different branches of the government. There's also a relationship between states and federal that goes back to the Iroquois Confederation. The Iroquois Confederation gave us the idea of federalism because the Iroquois tribes were loosely aligned as states, but they met as a nation to decide national issues, which is what we do, which is kind of cool. And another group that we borrowed from was, of course, the concept of popular sovereignty or votes, where we rely on the public to vote. Now, let's not quibble here. The only people who could vote were white, male, with money or property. That's it. A very small percentage of the population. But there was a concept that these people were doing it for the interests of everybody because you didn't want to have another Shea on your hands if you tore people away from those structures. Here's another cool thing about what I think about this topic in terms of how it relates. I believe it plants this concept seed of philosophy that we can all advance on an economic level if we have two things, of course, opportunity and means. And I think the opening of the Western territories, the opening of the West, is one of the great gifts that gives us the thought that even though we're poor, we can be rich. I can be as rich as Thomas Jefferson or George Washington. Real quick, let's go back to the articles. I forgot about the articles. The only gift of the articles that we need to remember. Let's see, where can I go with the articles? Let's go up here. The only positive coming out of the articles was the Northwest Ordinance. Ordinance. Spell it, boy. Ordinance. And this ordinance is what's going to create new states. It's also a really important concept because Virginia wanted to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Would that be funky or what? New Jersey was kind of ruined. They were locked in. So one of the things that the Northwest Ordinance did was it created a number of people and a size of territory that made states mostly look uniform. And if you look at the states from the Western Appalachians to about the Dakotas, even into places like Montana, and if you go just about as far south as Oklahoma, forget about Texas and California, New Mexico. Those were Mexican territories, so they're going to look funky. Florida's going to look funky. But if you look at the sizes of the states, they almost all look about the same size. Some of them are basically rectangles with the same geographical shape. So what's this all about? Well, this gave us a way to kind of settle the country in a way that was fair. So that's what I have to say about that. So anyway, let's go back down here. So economic opportunity means. That's why I think we buy into the Constitution, because we have this playing field that allows us to have this concept of what goes on. One addition to the Constitution that comes out of the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Oh, this is not good. Can I erase that? Yes, let's do it. Let's use the eraser. Oh, sweet. Go back here. Nice. Doing excellent work here. Bill of Rights. There was a fear amongst what's called the Anti-Federalists. Now, Anti-Federalists today could be related to modern-day conservatives. And the major reason is because they wanted to have a weak central government, a weak national government, and they wanted most of the power to be at a local level, which makes total sense if you're coming out of the revolutionary time period. Most of the Anti-Federalists were terrified of a national government because they didn't want a repeat of all the stuff that happened in Great Britain. Now, the Federalists, on the other hand, you might relate to modern-day liberals or Democrats, because the Federalists wanted, where did my pen thing go? They wanted a national government that had some power, but they wanted it limited. They didn't want it to just do whatever it wanted, government. So here's the argument. Small government, big government, small government, big government. So what is the Bill of Rights supposed to do? The Bill of Rights is supposed to enumerate or write down, enumerate certain freedoms, certain basic concepts of freedom that we came to that point to cherish. Most of it comes out of the abuse during the Revolution. So for instance, Amendment number 3 never really gets talked about because it's the Quartering Act. It basically says we will not put soldiers in your house. It's never happened since then. Like, nobody's put a soldier in anybody's house. But at least we've got this way of guaranteeing that if the government did it, we could attack them, sue them, push them out, do whatever it takes. The other amendments, like the first, which has got 4 freedoms attached to it, which is freedom of religion, freedom of religious assembly, freedom of press, and freedom of assembly, and speech. That's 5 freedoms, sorry, not 4, 5 freedoms. If you enumerate them, it puts a pressure on the government not to violate the rules. Now, what this allows us to do at this point, of course, is argue about how much freedom we've actually got. And one of the great arguments over time that will determine that, of course, will be how does the Supreme Court use its interpretation of the Constitution to talk about what happens with what goes down. So that's something to be said about that. All right. So when they create the Constitution, they sign off, they give the 9 out of 13, and the first president takes over. And that first president, George Washington, is leading the Congress through the early phases of our development. And it's the honeymoon period. Everybody's playing nice. In fact, we only have one political party at the time. We have one political party. So there's no arguments, really. There's no debates. But this one political party is beginning to fracture, and they're called the Federalists. And they're mostly what you would call moderates. I mean, they're not radicals. They're moderates. So you might call them Republicans and Democrats who are in the middle of the political spectrum. That's what they're all about. And President Washington is going to put several top-ranking people in terms of positions of power. I think he throws Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, bone. Alexander Hamilton gets the Treasury. John Adams gets Vice President. And then what happens for the next couple of election cycles is people move up chains of command. So Adams becomes the President. Jefferson becomes the Vice President. You know, Madison moves up into Secretary of State. All these things are kind of like moving until eventually we have a break, and that break comes a little bit down the road in the next couple of chapters. All right, so let me see if I've forgotten anything here in terms of what it... Hang on, Kelsey. You're now on tape, in case you didn't know that already. People are going to listen to you, and they're going to figure out, like, what are you saying, Miss Kelsey? That's okay. Let me stop. A couple more things I should add after my little daughter's interruption. Sorry about that. A couple more things. There was a huge convincing job. Most people didn't really vote. They didn't have a vote. So the average American is going to not be involved in this process. But there was this desire to assuage their fears, to keep them calm. So one of the great public relations propaganda jobs, whatever you want to call it, of that time period was the writing of several pamphlets which got posted in bars across the country called the Federalist Papers. And these were mostly written by Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, amongst others, but they wrote them anonymously because they did not want to look like pompous leaders of the elite. They wanted to look like average men. And they appealed to the masses by trying to explain the logic behind which we needed this new government, the logic of the government. And they used all kinds of different tools to do it. And most people couldn't read, so they would go to the bar and they'd say, "Hey, Joe, read this to me." And they would read this story about why we needed a Supreme Court, why we needed to have a Congress that was split by two. On the other hand, there was also a group of writers who were writing their own counter-arguments. These are the Anti-Federalist Papers. I think the Federalist Papers got more press coverage and they got more support because the elites were on the side of it. But the Anti-Federalists were basically critical of the fear that if we create this government, it's going to become a government that's going to take over everything else, which I think is unique and conceptually interesting at the time. Eventually, this is going to prove crucial in getting the 9 out of the 13 states to vote. And when we create our new Constitution and you look at the rules of it, the Constitution is intentionally vague on purpose. And I think what's nice about it being vague is that it's designed to be adapted to over time. And the other thing about it is it's not people-based, it's procedure-based. So if the president screws up, no big deal. You get rid of the president in the next election cycle. You don't even have to have a guillotine to knock his head off. Procedure-based means we have procedures of removal, procedures of adaptation, procedures of moving things along. And there's always going to be this interesting relationship between power and the people, which I think is in place. I think the other thing that many people don't realize is that your government is intentionally supposed to be slow. It's supposed to be slow, and it's supposed to look ineffective, or ineffectual, I suppose is a better way to look at it, because there's a huge fear of fast government. And the reason I think so is, what if government moves quickly and pushes something that is at once popular but is really bad into play? Well, then it's hard to get rid of it once it's in. So by being slow, ineffectual, having procedures, checks and balances, all these different loopholes, it makes government the best of its worst self, which is it looks terrible, it looks slow, it looks like nothing happens. But when something does happen, it takes a tremendous amount of effort, and it really matters. It really means something when it does happen. So many people should kind of like take a break and say, hey, it's supposed to be broken in a way. It's supposed to look broken because that's the way it was designed in the first place. And if you ever want to change your Constitution, the nice way to do that, of course, is to get two-thirds of all states or state legislatures or state populations to vote for an amendment. And we have put in place 27 of those bad boys since 88, when we put the Constitution in play in the beginning. John, hey Kels, you're on camera again. Isn't that kind of... Anyhow, that's about all I can think of right now. If you have more questions, we'll handle them in class. But I think that's a good tutorial about, I think, one of the main points of this chapter. And hopefully it gives you a chance to kind of hear it again and see it again. So we'll figure out how this new nation kind of pops into play later, and we'll deal with that on another level as well, okay? So thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.